This is week 2 of How to Be a Disciple, and this is part 2. I wanted to give us a recap of where we've been so far, because this whole series is based out of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 8:22 through the end of Mark chapter 10. So all of these lessons just kind of keep building on each other. Jesus was journeying with his disciples and teaching them along the way. This section is kind of marked by two healing of blind men. Mark 8:22 has the healing of one blind man that we talked about in week 1. And we'll look at in the last week, Jesus healing blind Bartimaeus. You see, Jesus healed this blind man in Mark 8:22. He touched his eyes, but he didn't see clearly the first time. Then the second time he touched him, he could see fully. You see, this was more than just Jesus healing this blind man. It was also Jesus teaching his disciples a lesson, teaching them that they had to see who he was clearly. You see, Jesus asked them this question, "Who do you say I am?" We see that Peter responds and says, "Jesus, you are the Messiah." And then Jesus starts talking about his death and not how he would have to die. And Peter stands in his way. You see, we have these moments where we see clearly and we see fully, and then these moments when we don't see the big picture, like Peter. Peter was standing in the way of Jesus' mission. So we looked at, in part 1, how we need to ask ourselves that question. Who do we say Jesus is? And then we have to figure out how we can live that out. And then in part 1 this week, we looked at the transfiguration. Jesus took three of his disciples up on a mountain and had this experience with them where God comes from the clouds and says, "This is my son." And we're going to pick up right there, right after that passage. This is in Mark 9, and it begins in verse 14. When they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them. Some teachers of the religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe and they ran out to greet him. "What is all this arguing about?" Jesus asked. One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk. Whenever the spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. Then he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." So Jesus said to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy, but when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can." "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly cried out, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. "Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak," he said, "I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as people said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Afterward, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, "Why couldn't we cast out that evil spirit?" Jesus replied, "This kind can be only cast out by prayer." You see, this whole section that happens right after the transfiguration was about belief. We talked about belief in part 1 this week, and this man has this interaction with Jesus. You see, this man has this interaction with Jesus. And our main point today that comes from this passage is that you can't do it on your own. In part 1, we looked at the point, you have to believe. This passage is all about belief. But this man that Jesus encounters recognizes that he can't do it on his own. You see, being a disciple means being a learner, means being a follower. Yet, as disciples of Jesus, we often try to do it on our own. We try to figure out problems on our own. We try to do it through our own strength. But the main thing we need to learn today is that we can't do it on our own. We have to trust and believe in Jesus. You see, this passage, we have this man who brings his son to Jesus. He tried to have his disciples cast out this spirit, but they were unable to. And this encounter that Jesus has with this man has this wonderful interaction between this man and Jesus. He says, Jesus, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. I think that's really how we feel a lot of times. It's this mixture of doubt and faith. But the man acknowledged that he couldn't do it on his own, that he needed help overcoming his unbelief. So what Jesus was teaching his disciples was how to believe and how to live out their belief, even when they had questions, even when they didn't fully see everything that was going on. You see, the main thing is to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to recognize that Jesus is your source of strength, that you can't do it on your own. A disciple will always be a disciple, meaning that we have to continue to learn. For us as disciples of Jesus, we have to acknowledge that Jesus is our source of strength. We have to be dependent on him. We have to acknowledge that we can't do it on our own. You see, for me, one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn in my life is just to acknowledge in those times where I don't know how to do something. It's like this whole series is becoming about what Jake can't do and how I have to learn all of these things. But for me, I've just had to acknowledge this. I'm not very handy. I really struggle to hang things up. I struggle to put things together. And one of the things that I've had to learn, especially when I'm helping somebody else, is to acknowledge this. I'm not very handy, but I'm willing to help. And you know, for us, our main point this week is we have to trust in Jesus. We have to acknowledge that we can't do it on our own. You see, to be a disciple of Jesus, we have to trust in him. We have to learn from him. And really, the man this week in the story that we read, his faith is a faith much like ours. We're going to have times of doubt and faith. We're going to have times where we believe, yet we doubt. We're going to have times when we are seeing things clearly, and yet we doubt. So, in learning how to be a disciple, you have to understand that a disciple is a learner. In the first week, we mentioned that you have to see who Jesus is. You have to see and figure out who Jesus is for you to follow him. You know, this week, we talked about how we have to believe. In our faith, we're going to have these times of faith and doubt. We're going to have these times when we completely see everything, and yet we completely fail the next moment. But for us, we have to acknowledge that we can't do it on our own. We have to acknowledge that we need Jesus. If we're going to be a disciple of Jesus, why try to do it ourselves? Trust in Jesus. You know, in these times of anxiousness and fear and anxiety with the coronavirus, this has kind of been my reflection. Jesus, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. Help me in my anxiousness. Help me in my fear. Help me to trust in you. Help me to continue to be your disciple, even in the midst of this. So how do you be a disciple? You have to believe in Jesus, and then you have to acknowledge that you can't do it on your own.